The morning I found out my neighbors thought they could use my land like it was community property, I almost dropped a fresh cup of coffee all over my porch. I'm not exaggerating either. One second, I was standing there enjoying a cool September morning, looking out over the pasture my family had owned for nearly 70 years, and the next I was staring at what looked like a construction supply yard that had magically appeared overnight. There were stacks of lumber, pallets of concrete blocks, giant coils of drainage pipe, portable barriers, orange fencing, and enough equipment to make it look like somebody was building a shopping center. At first, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong field. I blinked a couple times, took another sip of coffee, and just stood there trying to make sense of it. The problem was that I knew every inch of that property. My grandfather bought those 6 acres back when the county road was still gravel. My father raised cattle there. I learned how to drive a tractor there before I was old enough to drive a pickup truck. There wasn't a corner of that land I didn't know by heart. So when I saw all that stuff sitting right in the middle of it, I knew one thing immediately: nobody had permission. I drove my ATV down to the site and found a laminated sign zip-tied to the fencing. It read, "Temporary storage area for Meadow Ridge Community Expansion Project. Authorized personnel only." Underneath was a contact number. Now here's where things started making sense. About a mile away, a subdivision called Meadow Ridge had been expanding for years. Nice houses, manicured lawns, HOA rules thick enough to stop a bullet, the kind of place where people got warning letters if their mailbox paint faded too much. Lately, they'd been building a new recreation center, and from what I'd heard, the project was running behind schedule and over budget. Apparently, somebody on their board had decided my pasture looked like a convenient storage lot. What they hadn't bothered to do was ask. I called the number immediately. A guy answered after 2 rings. Confident voice. Relaxed tone. The kind of guy who sounded like he'd never heard the word no. "This is Grant Holloway," he said. "Project coordinator." I said, "Grant, my name is Ethan Mercer, and I'm standing on my property looking at a whole lot of your construction materials." There was a pause. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, that's what this is about." The way he said it immediately rubbed me the wrong way. I asked him what exactly he meant by that. He said, "Listen, Mr. Mercer, it's temporary. We're talking maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Nobody's using that section anyway." I looked around at the fencing, the equipment, the tire tracks cut through grass that had been growing untouched for years, and I felt my jaw tighten. "Nobody's using it," I said. "It's private property." He sighed like I was the difficult one. "Look, we're under a deadline. We needed space. It's not hurting anything." That's the sentence that stuck with me. It's not hurting anything. Funny how people always decide what's harmless when they're the ones benefiting from it. I told him I wanted every piece of equipment removed immediately. He chuckled again. "Let's be realistic here." Then he added something I still remember word for word. "Sometimes communities have to make small sacrifices for progress." Communities. Progress. Funny choice of words, considering I wasn't part of his community and the sacrifice wasn't his. The call ended about 30 seconds later, and by then I was more angry than I wanted to admit. Not because of the materials, not even because of the trespassing. It was the attitude, the assumption, the belief that because somebody wore a title and managed a project, normal rules somehow stopped applying. For the rest of that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried mowing a different section of pasture, tried fixing a gate near the creek, tried distracting myself with football. Nothing worked. Every time I looked outside, I saw those stacks of materials sitting there like a giant middle finger planted in the middle of family history. That even my neighbor Walt stopped by. Walt had known me since high school. Retired mechanic. Good man. The kind of guy who could fix anything with duct tape and stubbornness. He asked why I looked irritated. I pointed toward the pasture. He stared for about 10 seconds before saying, "You're kidding." I told him the whole story. By the time I finished, he was shaking his head. Then he started laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. About an hour later, another friend, Danny Ruiz, showed up to return a trailer he'd borrowed. I told him the story too. He laughed even harder than Walt did. "Hold on," Danny said. "They actually put up a sign telling you not to disturb stuff on your own land?" I nodded. Danny nearly fell off the tailgate laughing. But after the laughter faded, all three of us sat there quietly watching the sun go down over the pasture. The construction materials cast long shadows across the grass. That's when an idea started forming in the back of my mind. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't destructive. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more reasonable it seemed. If they wanted their property stored on my land so badly, maybe I could help them store it somewhere a little more memorable. I didn't mention the idea right away. I just sat there watching those shadows grow longer while Walt sipped his coffee and Danny leaned against the trailer. Eventually, Danny looked over and said, "You got that look?" I asked what look. He grinned. The look you get right before somebody regrets underestimating you. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. The funny thing is, once the idea got into my head, I couldn't stop refining it. That night, after Walt and Danny left, I pulled out property surveys, county records, and the original paperwork my grandfather kept in an old filing cabinet. I want to be absolutely certain before I did anything. Around midnight, I was still sitting at my kitchen table with maps spread everywhere. Every line matched. Every marker matched. Every document confirmed the same thing. Those materials were sitting entirely on my property. Not near the line. Not close to the line. Directly on my land. By 1 in the morning, I had made up my mind. The next afternoon, I called Danny. "You still have access to that forklift?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he laughed. I knew it. After that, I called Walt. He owned a flatbed trailer and a tractor that looked older than both of us combined, but somehow never stopped working. Neither man asked many questions. They just agreed to meet Saturday night. For the next couple days, I went about my routine while the Meadow Ridge project continued as if nothing had happened. Trucks came and went. Workers dropped off more supplies. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody called to apologize. Nobody asked permission. Every time I saw that, my decision felt more justified. Saturday finally arrived. Around 10, that evening the three of us met near the barn. The sky was clear. The air had that cool fall feeling that makes every sound seem louder. We parked with our lights off and looked across the pasture toward the construction supplies. Walt folded his arms. Last chance to be the bigger man. I shook my head. I've been the bigger man all week. Danny grinned. Then let's get to work. What happened next felt almost surreal. We weren't stealing anything. We weren't damaging anything. We were simply relocating property that had been dumped on my land without permission. We started with the lumber. Danny used a forklift while Walt directed him. I drove the tractor. Back and forth we went, carrying materials deeper into the pasture, nearly 3 football fields farther from the road than before. The farther we moved everything, the more ridiculous the original storage site looked. Empty fencing, empty space, no supplies. By midnight, we had moved half the materials. By 2 in the morning, we had moved all of them. Every pallet, every pipe, every stack of lumber, every crate. Everything now sat in a low section of pasture surrounded by old fence lines and uneven terrain. Getting it back out wouldn't be impossible. Just inconvenient. Very inconvenient. We could have stopped there. Honestly, that probably would have been enough. But then Danny pointed at an old pile of rusted barbed wire that had been sitting near the equipment shed for years. You know, he said, if this is a storage facility now, it should probably look official. Walt nearly choked laughing. That's when the project evolved. For the next couple hours, we transformed their neat little storage yard into something entirely different. We stacked old tractor tires around the perimeter. We used weathered fence posts from a collapsed cattle enclosure. We wrapped rusted wire around sections of the boundary. Not enough to trap anything. Not enough to damage anything. Just enough to make the entire area look like the saddest junkyard in the county. Then came the sign. The sign was Danny's idea. We found a giant sheet of plywood in my barn. Walt painted the background white while Danny sprayed giant red letters across the middle. By the time we finished, the sign read, "Welcome to the Meadow Ridge Junk Storage Preserve." Established without permission. We stood back and admired our work. The thing looked ridiculous, which made it perfect. Around sunrise, we finally headed back toward the house. I remember standing on the porch with another cup of coffee, looking across the pasture. The materials were all still there, undamaged, intact, perfectly safe. But now they looked like they belonged in some forgotten roadside scrapyard. I slept for maybe 3 hours before my phone started buzzing. The first call came around 8:30. Grant. I let it ring. Then it rang again. Grant. Again. Then again. Finally, he left a voicemail. I played it while making breakfast. The confidence from our first conversation was completely gone. Mr. Mercer, this is Grant Holloway. We seem to have a situation. Please call me back immediately. A situation. I laughed out loud. 10 minutes later, another voicemail arrived. This one sounded more stressed. By lunchtime, my phone had recorded 6 missed calls. Meanwhile, the real entertainment was happening outside. I parked near the road where I could watch without being noticed. Around 9 o'clock, 3 HOA trucks arrived. Workers got out expecting a normal day. At first, they just stood there staring at the empty storage area. Then they started walking around. One guy pointed toward the pasture. Another guy climbed onto a truck bumper, trying to see farther. Eventually, somebody spotted the materials in the distance. That's when the confusion began. Vehicles started moving. Managers arrived. More trucks showed up. People pointed, argued, waved clipboards around. From where I sat, it looked like an anthill somebody had kicked open. Around 11, Grant himself arrived. Even from a distance, I could tell he was furious. He marched across the field with 2 other supervisors following behind him. They reached the relocated materials and simply stood there staring. The giant plywood sign was impossible to miss. One supervisor took pictures. Another put his hands on his hips. Grant just stared. I wish I could tell you I felt guilty. I didn't. Not even a little. What I felt was satisfaction. Because for the first time all week, they were dealing with inconvenience instead of me. Later that afternoon, Grant finally caught me outside near my mailbox. He pulled up in a company truck and climbed out looking exhausted. Did you do this? He asked. I looked at him. Do what? His jaw tightened. Move our materials. Your materials? I asked. You mean the materials sitting on my property? He took a deep breath. This isn't funny. I agree, I said. Trespassing usually isn't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he tried a different approach. Look, mistakes were made. That was the first time anybody from Meadow Ridge had called it a mistake. Funny how language changes when consequences arrive. I asked him if he remembered telling me to relax. He looked away. I asked if he remembered saying communities sometimes needed to make sacrifices. He didn't answer. Then I handed him copies of the property survey. Every boundary marker. Every legal description. Every county record. He flipped through them silently. The fight left his face almost immediately. Because he knew what I knew. Legally, he didn't have much ground to stand on. Before leaving, he looked back toward the pasture. This is causing major delays. I nodded. I imagine it is. Contractors are waiting. That's unfortunate. Materials may need to be reordered. Sounds expensive. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he climbed back in his truck and drove away. What happened over the next few weeks was even more satisfying than I expected. The recreation center project started slipping behind schedule. Deliveries had to be rearranged. Contractors complained. Meetings were held. Budgets grew. Rumors spread throughout the subdivision. Some residents blamed management. Others blamed the board. A few blamed me. But the funniest part was that every version of the story eventually came back to the same question. Why had nobody simply asked permission in the first place? Nobody seemed able to answer that. And every time another delay hit the project, I remembered Grant standing in my pasture telling me to relax while he used land that didn't belong to him. By the second month, the giant plywood sign had become something of a local legend. People driving past would slow down just to look at it. Some took pictures. A few posted them online. One resident from Meadow Ridge actually stopped and apologized on behalf of the community. He told me most homeowners had no idea what management had done. That conversation stuck with me because it reminded me that the real problem was never the neighborhood itself. It was the handful of people who believed rules only applied to everyone else. And as winter approached, the pressure inside Meadow Ridge kept building. By the time winter rolled around, the entire situation had taken on a life of its own. What started as a simple act of trespassing had turned into a cautionary tale that people all over the county seemed to know about. I couldn't stop at the gas station without somebody asking if I was the guy with the junkyard sign. At first it was strange, then became entertaining. The Meadow Ridge board, meanwhile, was dealing with problems that kept multiplying. The recreation center project was months behind schedule. Contractors were demanding answers. Homeowners were asking questions at meetings. Costs were climbing. And every time somebody dug into what had happened, they ended up right back at the same decision made by someone who thought private property rights were more like suggestions than actual rules. One afternoon, a few weeks before Christmas, I got another call from Grant. This time his voice sounded completely different from the man I'd spoken to that first morning. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the confidence. He sounded tired. Honestly, he sounded like a guy who had spent months explaining a bad decision to angry people. "Ethan," he said, "I'd like to meet in person." I considered saying no. Part of me wanted to let him sit with the consequences a little longer. But another part of me was curious. So we agreed to meet at a diner just outside town. When I walked in, Grant was already sitting in a booth near the window. He looked older than I remembered. Stress has a way of doing that. We ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes talking about absolutely nothing. Weather, traffic, local football. The kind of conversation two men have when they're both avoiding the real topic. Finally, Grant leaned back and sighed. "You know," he said, "when this started, I honestly thought you'd eventually give in." I laughed. "That's because you never bothered asking what kind of person I was." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Then he surprised me. He apologized. Not one of those corporate apologies where someone says they're sorry you were offended. A real apology. He admitted they had been under pressure. Admitted shortcuts were taken. Admitted he should have spoken to me before a single pallet ever touched my property. For a moment, I just sat there listening. The truth was, I hadn't expected that. I expected excuses. I expected blame shifting. Instead, I got honesty. And oddly enough, that took some of the anger out of me. We talked for nearly an hour. By the end of the conversation, I realized something important. The conflict had never really been about lumber or fencing or construction supplies. It had been about respect. People can handle mistakes. Most reasonable folks understand that errors happen. What they don't handle well is being treated like they don't matter. That's what had pushed me over the edge. Not the materials, not the inconvenience, the attitude. The assumption that my rights could be brushed aside because somebody else's project seemed more important. A few weeks later, Meadow Ridge finally completed the process of removing every last piece of material from my pasture. They did it properly this time. They coordinated access. They communicated. They stayed within agreed boundaries. Amazing how smoothly things work when people act like adults. The giant sign came down shortly after that. Not because anybody forced me to remove it. Honestly, I just felt like its job was finished. The lesson had already been delivered. The old tires disappeared too. The rusted wire got hauled away. Eventually, the corner of pasture started looking like itself again. Grass grew back. Tire tracks faded. Nature did what nature always does and slowly erased the evidence. But not all of it. I left one section of fence standing near the spot where the original sign had been. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple reminder. Every time I drive past it, I remember that entire chain of events and how quickly things escalated because somebody chose convenience over respect. Sometimes friends ask whether I'd do it all again. The answer is complicated. If they're asking whether I defend my property, absolutely. Without hesitation. If they're asking whether I'd choose the exact same method, I'm not sure. Maybe age makes you think differently. Maybe experience does. What I know is that standing up for yourself matters. And I also know that people in positions of authority occasionally become so accustomed to getting their way that they stop considering how their decisions affect others. Every now and then, reality reminds them. Looking back now, the funniest part isn't the sign or the junkyard setup or even the panic on Grant's face that morning. The funniest part is how completely avoidable everything was. One knock on my door, one honest conversation, one simple request. That's all it would have taken. There's a good chance I might have worked something out with them. We'll never know because they never asked. Instead, they assumed. And assumptions have a way of becoming expensive. So that's my story. A story about property lines, stubborn personalities, and a lesson that ended up costing far more than anyone expected. But now I want to hear from you. If you walked outside one morning and discovered somebody had turned your land into their personal storage yard without permission, what would you have done? Would you have called a lawyer immediately? Would you have demanded compensation? Would you have handled it differently than I did? And more importantly, what do you think the line is between defending your rights and taking revenge? Let me know down in the comments, because I can already tell this is one of those stories where people are going to have very different opinions. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a little small-town justice. Trust me, I'd love to hear what side of this argument you're on.